The Montana wind cut sharp as a knife, carrying snowflakes that stung like needles. Inside the weather-beaten stable behind the Copper Lantern Saloon, a woman's muffled cries tangled with the restless whinnies of horses. He found her there. Ragged, furious, trembling with defiance, even in the dirt. "Every scream drives me deeper," he growled, though not with cruelty, but with a promise. The kind a man makes when he's done running from ghosts. In that moment, two broken lives collided. The Montana Territory, 1883, was no place for the faint of heart. Bitter winters snapped bones and tested souls. Nestled between the Bitterroot Range and endless open plains lay the town of Dry Creek, a place where fortunes were made, lives were lost, and every soul carried secrets heavier than the snow. Clara had walked into Dry Creek with nothing but a faded carpet bag and the kind of eyes that told men she wasn't easily broken. Folks called her the saloon girl at the Copper Lantern, but she'd once been more than that. She could read ledgers faster than most bankers and shoot straighter than most drifters. Still, the past clung to her like smoke, and the whispers followed. She's running from something. Across town, James Callahan worked his spread of nearly 500 head of cattle with the efficiency of a man who had no time for dreams. Widowed 3 years, his heart buried alongside his wife, he poured every ounce of grit into raising his 12-year-old daughter Annie. His ranch was steady, his hands loyal, his future empty. That winter, when a bitter storm and an unexpected fire left him short on help, fate tossed Clara straight into his path. He didn't want a saloon girl on his land. She didn't want another man trying to own her. But the Montana Territory had a way of testing two stubborn hearts. The storm rolled in fierce that night, rattling shutters across Dry Creek. Clara wiped down the bar, ignoring the leering comments tossed her way. When the saloon doors cracked open, a tall man stepped through, his dark duster coated white. James Callahan. Everyone knew the rancher with the tired eyes and the girl who shadowed him like a colt. Tonight, though, he looked less like a man stopping for a drink and more like one carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He set his gloves on the bar. "Is Harlan here?" The barkeep shook his head. "Gone south last week." James cursed under his breath. His foreman's sudden departure, right before a fire licked through one of his hay barns. It was too convenient. He was scrambling to keep the herd fed. He needed hands. Any hands. That's when Clara spoke, surprising herself as much as anyone. "I can ride, rope too, if it's work you need." The room went quiet. A few men laughed. "You?" someone drawled, but James didn't laugh. He studied Clara the way a man sizes up a horse, searching for strength in the bone. Her chin didn't flinch. "You from ranch country?" he asked. "Wyoming," she said. The word carried the weight of a truth she wished was a lie. Annie peeked out from behind him, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Pa? She looks like she knows what she's talking about." Clara crouched slightly, meeting the girl's gaze. "Well, Annie, I reckon your pa's cattle don't care if it's a man or a woman driving them, long as someone gets the job done." Annie grinned. Something flickered in James's eyes. He hated needing help, but his herd didn't care about pride, and neither did the storm. "Be at my ranch by sunup," he said at last. "If you can keep up, you'll earn your pay." Clara nodded once, sharp as a soldier taking orders. She'd sworn never to tie herself to another man's land, but this was survival, and maybe a chance to prove she was more than the whispers said. As James and Annie left, snow swirling in, Clara caught the man's profile. A strong jaw, grief etched deep. For the first time since leaving Wyoming, her heart stuttered. Not for love, but for possibility, and a deep, cold dread that her past was about to catch up with her. Dawn came cold and blue. Clara arrived at the Callahan spread on a flea-bitten mare, frost glazing the fence rails. James met her in the yard, hat brim iced. Annie clutched a wool shawl at his side. "You're late," he said. It's sunrise, she replied. In winter, we call this 5 minutes late. His mouth didn't quite hide a smile. You'll ride, Gus. He throws light riders. Clara ran a hand down the sorrel's neck. The gelding danced, rolling an eye to test her nerve. She saddled him with practiced hands, stepped lightly into the stirrup. Gus crow-hopped twice. She gave him his head, sat deep, calm as a church door. When he tried a side shy, she pressed a knee and murmured, "Easy, boy." The sorrel blew out and settled. He'd been waiting for a steady hand. From the fence, one of the ranch hands whistled. "Mount up," James cut in, but his gaze lingered, measuring her. They rode out across a pasture scabbed with snow. The herd balled tight in the draw, steam rising in slow ghosts. "We lost hay last night," James pointed. "Need the windbreak rebuilt and calves checked for frostbite." "I'll start with the windbreak," Clara said, already swinging down. James opened his mouth to argue, then shut it. Annie slipped from her pony and trailed Clara with earnest steps. Together they hauled split rails, drove posts with a maul, and tied boughs as a shield against the wind. James watched, silent, while snow scudded over the ground. By noon, the windbreak stood firm. In the tack room, Clara found a cracked stirrup leather and mended it with even, tiny stitches. Annie perched on a hay bale, watching as if the needle were a magician's wand. "What's that stitch called?" Annie asked. "Back stitch. Holds tighter than a promise," Clara said. "Here, your turn." When Annie finally pulled a tidy line of stitches, she lit up in a way that warmed the room more than the stove. James came in to fetch a comb and stopped, taking in the scene. His daughter, learning from a woman the town called a saloon girl. His brows drew tight, then eased. "We could use that stitch on the sleigh harness," he said. "If you have a mind." "I have a mind," Clara said. After a dinner of salt pork and beans, Clara pulled a ledger from the shelf. She flipped through, frowning. "Your hay tally's off," she said. "Looks like your foreman counted bales by stack height, not by weight, and you paid Tom Lantry at the forge for 4 shoes. Twice." James stiffened. "You calling me careless?" "I'm calling it winter and a man down," she said evenly. "We can fix it." "We." The word landed between them like an ember. She set to work, chalk on slate, her numbers singing into order, the shape of solvency and sense reappearing like a trail after a whiteout. "I know ledgers because men once thought that was all I was good for," she said, eyes on the page. "Turns out I can do both sides of the books and the barn." Gossip seeped through the valley faster than thaw. At Finch's general store, Mrs. Finch murmured, "I hear you've taken on new help, Mr. Callahan." James endured it with the patience of a man who knew the land judged more harshly than people. "Folks will talk," Clara said as they loaded oats into the wagon, their hands brushing. Heat tore up her arm at the accidental touch. She pretended to adjust a knot. "They do," James agreed. He didn't move his hand, not right away. The pause stretched. Something like apology flickered in his face. Something like want. On the road home, a ground blizzard rose sudden. A white sheet whipped from the heavens. The team balked, the sleigh skittering sideways. Clara slipped to the pole, fingers quick on the harness. She unhooked a trace, angled the horses chest to wind, heads together. She tied a scarf over her mouth and shouted, but the words were less important than the calm in her body. The horses read it like scripture. They steadied. James stared at her, snow stinging both their faces. "You always know what to do?" he asked when their breath came easy again. "No," she said. "I just don't like dying." Annie's laugh rang out, bright as sleigh bells. She slid her hand into Clara's mitten. "I'm glad you came." Clara looked at James over Annie's bonnet. His gaze answered plain: gratitude, respect, danger. He tipped his hat lower, as if to hide all three, and in that moment, a new, more dangerous thought crossed Clara's mind. The foreman leaving, the fire, the sudden need for help. What if none of it was an accident? What if someone wanted her on this ranch for a reason she couldn't yet see? The days rolled on, carved by hardship and a quiet rhythm. One evening, while James sharpened an axe, Clara walked out with a bucket of kindling. Annie chased a pup across the yard. "You don't talk much," Clara said. James tested the blade. "Talking won't keep the herd alive." "True," she said, "but sometimes talking keeps a man alive." He met her eyes, and in them she saw the weight of a widower's silence. The air between them thickened, charged. Later in the barn, Annie was tracing her hands over a horse's neck. "Do you miss her?" Annie asked suddenly. Clara stilled. "Who?" "Whoever you left behind." The girl had her father's eyes sharp and direct. "I had a brother," Clara said, kneeling beside her. "He was wild, but kind. Took a bullet in Cheyenne. Wrong place, wrong night. After that, the town felt empty. I kept moving so the emptiness wouldn't catch me." Annie slipped her hand into Clara's. "Pa moves, too. Inside, I mean. He doesn't let folks see, but I know." James had been standing in the shadow of the barn door, listening. He stepped into the lantern glow. He carried no judgment, only the heavy truth of a man who'd also buried someone he loved. Their gazes met, and for the first time, James's eyes softened. The steel gave way to quiet sorrow. That night, after Annie was in bed, Clara lingered by the hearth. James sat across from her, boots unlaced. "My wife's name was Sarah," he said, the words seeming to cost him. "She died giving Annie life. Buried her with the wild roses by the south pasture." "That's a hard trade," Clara said softly. He nodded, jaw tight. "I swore I wouldn't ask another woman to shoulder this place. Not fair." Sometimes fairness has nothing to do with what a heart needs. Just then, Annie shuffled out in her nightdress and climbed into Clara's lap, curling there as if she'd belonged all along. James watched, a storm crossing his face. Longing, fear, something deeper. When he carried Annie back to bed, Clara stared into the flames. The emptiness she'd been out running had eased. When James returned, he paused behind her chair, close enough that the heat of him mingled with the fire. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It no longer spoke only of grief. It carried promise. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her past was a predator, circling just beyond the firelight, and she had led it right to this family's door. The thaw came sudden and swift. Snowmelt swelled the creek, turning pastures into quagmires. James rode out at first light, Clara and Annie close behind. What they saw froze their blood. Half the herd stranded in the floodplain, the current rising fast. "Damn it," James muttered. "If we don't move them now, we'll lose near 50 head. The other ranch hands were north. It was just the three of them. Clara didn't wait for orders. "We'll push them upriver to the slope by the cottonwoods." James turned, thunder in his eyes. "That current will sweep you under in seconds." "Then stay on the bank and argue," she shot back. "I'll ride." Annie's voice cracked through the tension. "She's right, Pa. Gus is steady in water." For a heartbeat, James looked torn between fury and fear. Then he swore. "Fine, but I'm riding with you." Together, they spurred into the floodplain, icy water slapping their thighs. The herd panicked, hooves turning mud into chaos. Clara whooped sharp, swinging her rope, and the cattle turned toward her cry. James mirrored her on the other side, his deep voice booming commands. For an hour they fought the water. Twice Clara nearly lost her seat, but each time she righted herself, grit unshaken. James's eyes never left her, fear and admiration warring in his face. At last, only a calf remained, caught midstream. Annie shrieked from the bank, "It's going under!" Without thought, Clara plunged from her saddle into the freezing current. The shock bit her lungs. She looped her rope around the calf and shouted, "Pull, James!" James hauled from horseback, muscles straining. Clara kicked, guiding the calf until it scrambled onto the bank. She dragged herself from the water, coughing, shaking. James was there instantly, hauling her to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You damn fool," he rasped, his voice breaking. "You could have drowned." "But I didn't," she said, shivering. "Neither did the calf." Something cracked open in him. He pulled her against him, rough and fierce, forehead pressed to hers. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," he whispered. Annie looked up, wide-eyed. But instead of fear, she smiled. That night, James stood by the window, staring into the dark. "When Sarah died," he said, his voice low, "I swore I'd never risk letting another woman close. Too much to lose. But today, seeing you in that river, I realized I'd already lost if I tried to push you away." Clara's hands trembled where they gripped her mug. Here was a man offering roots, not with pretty words, but with raw fear and truth. The silence between them was heavy as a church bell. Their lives had tangled. Neither flood nor fear could pull them apart now. But as they stood there, a lone rider approached the ranch, moving fast. He wasn't one of James's men. He pulled up short of the main house, a silhouette against the moon. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but holding something up. A piece of paper. Then he let it drop to the ground, turned his horse, and galloped away into the night. James grabbed his rifle, but Clara stopped him. "Wait." She walked out onto the porch, her heart a cold knot in her chest. She already knew. She picked up the paper. It was a wanted poster, old weathered from Wyoming. It showed a drawing of a young man with a wild grin, and beneath it the name, Caleb, wanted for bank robbery and murder. And scrawled across the bottom in fresh, crude letters were 3 words. "We know you're here." The wanted poster felt like ice in Clara's hands. James came up behind her, taking the paper. His face hardened as he read it. "Caleb," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your brother." It wasn't a question. "He and his partners robbed a bank in Cheyenne," Clara said, her voice hollow. "It went wrong. A guard was killed. Caleb took a bullet. He died in my arms, but before he did, he told me where they'd stashed the money, and he gave me their ledger." "The ledger," James repeated, the pieces clicking into place. "That's why you know numbers." "It's more than numbers," she whispered. "It's proof. Every dirty deal they ever made, every man they paid off. Caleb's partner, a man named Silas Thorne, he wants that book back. He's been hunting me ever since." Now James understood. The whispers, her skill with horses and numbers, the haunted look in her eyes. She wasn't just running from grief. She was running from a killer. "Where is it?" he asked. She pointed to the faded carpet bag she'd kept by her bed. "Sewn into the lining." He crossed the room, took a knife, and carefully slit the stitches. He pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped book. He opened it. Columns of names, dates, and figures. It was a map of corruption that stretched across 2 territories. And then he saw a name he recognized. "Harlan," he breathed. "His old foreman." "He was on their payroll," Clara confirmed. "He sent word to Thorne that I was here. The fire. It wasn't an accident, was it? It was a message." A cold fury settled over James. "They used me. They used my ranch to corner you." "They wanted to force you to hire help," Clara added, "hoping I'd be desperate enough to take the job. They've been watching us this whole time." The ranch wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. "We have to go to the sheriff," James said, but Clara shook her head. "The sheriff in Cheyenne was on their payroll. How do we know the one here isn't?" She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "They will kill anyone who gets in their way, James. They'll kill you. They'll hurt Annie." That was the line. The thought of Annie in danger turned James's fear into cold, hard resolve. "No," he said. "This ends here. On my land." He turned to her, his decision made. Clara, I can't keep it down any longer. I need you. Not just on this ranch. In my life. He dropped to one knee on the worn floorboards. Clara, will you marry me? Will you fight with me? Tears streamed down her face. Yes, she whispered. Yes, James Callahan. 100 times, yes. He rose, sweeping her into his arms. It wasn't just a proposal. It was a declaration of war. At the top of the stairs, Annie watched, a smile blooming on her face. They didn't have time for a proper wedding. They rode into Dry Creek at dawn and had the preacher marry them in his study, with the sheriff and his wife as surprised witnesses. The news spread like wildfire. James Callahan had married the saloon girl. But they weren't celebrating. They were preparing. When they returned to the ranch, James called his hands together. He told them everything. This isn't just my fight anymore, he said. Thorne's gang threatens all of us. Anyone who wants to ride out, I won't hold it against you. Not a single man moved. These were men loyal to James, men who had come to respect Clara. We're with you, boss, one of them said. The others nodded in grim agreement. The waiting was the worst part. They fortified the ranch, boarding up windows, setting up lookout points. Clara taught Annie how to load a rifle, her small hands moving with surprising speed. The attack came 2 nights later, under the cover of a new moon. They came in silent, a dozen shadows moving through the darkness. A shotgun blast from a lookout shattered the quiet. The battle for the Callahan Ranch had begun. Gunfire erupted from all sides. The ranch hands, positioned in the house and barn, returned fire with disciplined volleys. James directed the defense from the porch, his rifle cracking in the night. Clara was beside him, reloading a second rifle, her movements fast and sure. "They're trying to get to the barn!" James yelled over the din. "They want to set the hay ablaze, flush us out!" One of the shadows broke from cover, a torch in his hand, sprinting for the barn doors. Clara raised her rifle, took a breath, and fired. The shadow dropped. The torch sputtered out in the dirt. A cheer went up from the ranch hands. But more figures were moving, using the cattle as cover, pushing them toward the house in a panicked stampede. "They're trying to break our line!" James roared. "Hold steady!" The ground trembled as the terrified animals thundered toward them. For a moment, it looked like they would be overrun. Then Annie, from an upstairs window, fired her small rifle into the air. The sharp crack, different from the heavy boom of the men's guns, seemed to startle the lead steer. It veered sideways, and the rest of the herd followed, stampeding past the house and into the darkness. James looked up at the window, a look of fierce pride on his face. The fight raged for another hour. 2 of Thorne's men were down, and one of James's hands had taken a bullet to the leg. The attackers were relentless, but the ranch's defense was unbreakable. Finally, seeing his advantage lost, Silas Thorne called for a retreat. The remaining shadows melted back into the night. In the sudden, ringing silence, they took stock. They had won the battle, but Thorne was still out there, and he still wanted that ledger. The next morning, the sheriff rode out with a posse. He had found the 2 bodies and could no longer deny that a war had come to Dry Creek. "We'll hunt him down, James," he promised. But James knew Thorne wouldn't be found so easily. He was a ghost. That evening, as Clara tended to the wounded ranch hand, a thought struck her, a terrible, cold certainty. "He's not running," she said to James. "He's not trying to get away." "What do you mean?" "This was never just about the ledger," she said, her eyes wide with a new understanding. "It's about revenge. For Caleb. Thorne thinks you, this ranch, stole me from him." She remembered something her brother had said in his last moments. "Thorne. He thinks of you as his." "He's not going to run," Clara repeated, her voice trembling. "He's coming for me." And she knew just where he would go. Not the ranch, with its armed guards. Somewhere public. Somewhere she would feel safe. "The school social," she whispered. "It's tonight." The schoolhouse was alive with lanterns and laughter. The entire town of Dry Creek was there, a fragile peace settling over them after the failed raid. James didn't want them to go. It's too dangerous. It's the only way, Clara insisted. He wants to isolate me, to make me a target. We have to draw him out on our terms, in front of everyone. They arrived with Annie between them, James's hand never far from his Colt, and two of his best men watching from the shadows outside. The pie auction was in full swing. Mrs. Greeley was, as predicted, bidding far too much for a blueberry pie. Clara felt 100 eyes on her. The saloon girl who was now the rancher's wife, the woman who had brought a war to their town. Then she saw him. Silas Thorne was standing by the refreshment table pouring a cup of cider. He was dressed like a respectable townsman, a smile on his face. No one seemed to notice him. No one but her. He raised his cup in a silent toast, his eyes cold and empty as a snake's. He had walked right into the middle of them. The room was suddenly too hot, the air too thick to breathe. James saw him at the same moment. He moved to put himself between Thorne and his family, his body a solid wall. "Get Annie out of here," he murmured to Clara. But it was too late. Thorne started walking toward them, his smile never wavering. The townsfolk parted before him, sensing the sudden chill in the air. "Mrs. Callahan," Thorne said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "A pleasure to see you looking so settled." He let his gaze drift to Annie, who was clutching Clara's skirt. "A beautiful family." "Thorne," James said, his voice a low warning, "this is not the time or the place." "Oh, I think it's the perfect place," Thorne replied, his eyes flicking back to Clara. "We have some unfinished business, you and I. A certain book of accounts." The sheriff, standing near the door, finally realized who he was looking at. His hand went to his gun. "Thorne, you're under arrest." Thorne laughed. "You in what army, Sheriff?" At his signal, 4 men who had been mingling with the crowd drew their pistols. The room erupted in screams. People dove for cover. In the chaos, Thorne grabbed Annie, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "The ledger, Clara," he snarled, his mask of civility gone, "or the girl dies." James raised his pistol, but he had no clear shot. Clara stood frozen, her worst nightmare come to life. The ledger was back at the ranch, hidden. She had walked right into his trap. "I don't have it here," she cried. "Then you're all going to die," Thorne spat, pressing the barrel of his gun to Annie's temple. Annie didn't scream. She looked at her father, then at Clara. Her small face was pale, but her eyes were defiant. And then she did something no one expected. She stomped down, hard, on Thorne's instep with the heel of her little boot. Thorne roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all James needed. His gun fired once. The shot was deafening in the small schoolhouse. Thorne staggered back, a look of shock on his face, his hand going to the red stain blooming on his chest. He fell, pulling a tablecloth and a punch bowl down with him. His men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. That hesitation cost them. James's ranch hands, positioned outside, burst through the windows and doors. The sheriff and the townsmen who had guns joined the fray. The fight was brutal but short. Thorne's gang was cornered and outmatched. When the smoke cleared, Silas Thorne was dead. His remaining men were in chains. James rushed to Annie, sweeping her into his arms. Clara was right behind him, her arms wrapping around them both, her body shaking with relief. They were safe. It was finally over. Spring arrived on the prairie with stubborn beauty. By the time the first wildflowers broke through, James and Clara Callahan were the heart of Dry Creek. The wedding, their real wedding, took place beneath the cottonwoods by the south pasture, where wild roses grew thick around Sarah's grave. James had chosen the place on purpose, not to shadow the new union, but to honor the old. "She'd want this," he whispered to Clara, taking her hands. "She'd want me to live again." The whole town was there. The preacher spoke simple words, and when James slid his mother's silver ring onto Clara's finger, the crowd erupted in cheers. Annie threw herself into their arms, laughing. Now we're all together. Forever. The celebration spilled across the yard. Fiddles played, boots stomped, and pies vanished. Clara danced with Annie, then with James, his strong hands steady on her waist. "You've given me back more than I thought I'd ever have," he murmured. "You've given me a home," she answered. The sky deepened to velvet. Stars scattered like diamonds. As the music slowed, James drew Clara and Annie close. "This is it," he said softly. "My family, my heart." Clara leaned into him, Annie pressed between them, and for the first time in years she felt no urge to run. The prairie stretched vast and unforgiving, but in that small circle of arms, she had found her place. Under the wild Montana sky, a new chapter began, not of survival alone, but of love, belonging, and the fierce promise of forever. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.